everybody here. Thanks for tuning in. Appreciate you guys. I don't know where you guys are at, but it's a dreary day here in Chicago, which is a perfect day to hunker down in front of a computer and talk drinking history while you're drinking. So I hope that's what you guys are doing. Thanks again for your support. As always, this is your virtual tavern, your virtual drinking space and learning space. So please use the chat room just as you would a bar, ask questions, and just kind of hang out. And that's kind of it. You guys are a part of this too. Want to welcome Jon Grinspan here. I'm pretty excited about this, Jon. This is what you're going to talk about. This is sort of that thing that sort of gets all of my insides pretty excited. 19th century saloons and drinking, and certainly the role that those entities have played on our American systems and history. Just for you guys who are out there, the world is such a small space. Jon, of course, is a colleague of my good friend and a Bruseum team member, Teresa McCullough, who is the beer historian at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. And as we've been thinking about how to further our collaboration, she immediately said, please talk to Jon. He's great. He's written some great articles and incredibly informative books. Immediately we talked about your book, The Virgin Vote, How Young Americans Made Democracy, Social Politics, Personal, and Voting Popular in the 19th Century. And then, of course, it led us to saloons and drinking in the 19th century. And it was very important to us here at the Bruseum, just so everyone knows, that October be really focused on issues that are relevant to us today. So what we're doing here is we're talking about how alcohol historically has always been political. We're talking about the role of women and people of color in democracy and the right to vote, and alcohol with that. And then we actually are doing another program at the end of the month with another Smithsonian museum, the National Postal Museum, to talk about the importance and history of the United States Postal Service, which will play a major role in this election. So aside from all of that, I'm going to stop talking because I'm already tired of hearing myself talk. And I'm just going to hand it over to Jon. And again, please use that chat room, ask questions. Jon, thanks again for being here. The virtual tavern is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Liz, and thank you, Lucas, for putting this together. I really appreciate the invitation, and I know whenever you talk to beer people, there's just a ton of expertise in the room. So if I say anything wrong, please stop me and correct me. If you have any questions about what I'm talking about, I'm happy to just jump right in with a question, please. And if I don't hear you, if you're muted, wave your arms. We can stop and ask questions as we go, and you can correct me. Yeah.
Jon, you know that beer people are just like historians. Everyone loves to argue about something.
As long as your interjection which begins with a compliment to me, I am fine with an argument afterwards. You know, just for my ego. No, I'd love to have a back and forth. I think there'll be questions at the end, but if as I talk, there are things you want to know more about, I love this stuff. So I'd be happy to field any questions. And I'll just take you through the history of beer and saloons and politics, and we'll go from there. So, and you can all hear me okay, is that right?
Sounds great.
Okay, awesome. So we have an election in a month, and over the next month, we're going to hear a lot about get out the vote techniques and turnout numbers and statistics. But I'm here to tell you guys about the greatest turnout device in American history, which is beer, specifically lager beer served in saloons in the second half of the 1800s. This period in the second half of the 1800s is both the high tide of saloon culture in America and really the high tide of voter turnout in America. This is a period, we kind of forget it, but it's a period of huge popular political engagement in the issues of the day, both among those who are allowed to vote and among those who are denied the right to vote, but still care deeply about the politics in their communities. And it's no coincidence that these two things coincide. This deep engagement in politics coincides with this incredible growth and significance in lager-focused saloons in America. This is the period when saloons really come to organize social life for a large majority of working class people, especially immigrant populations. And this is because we're talking about a nation in the 1800s that's in the midst of huge disruptions. The lives of almost everyone is deeply shaken. the course of events from family to family, generation to generation, is probably more disrupted in the 19th century than at any other period in world history. And you can see it in a place like Chicago more than anywhere else. So Chicago goes from a population of 30,000 to something like 300,000 in about a generation. A significant portion of the city burns down in 1871 and comes back stronger and is rebuilt almost immediately. I think the growth and value of goods in Chicago increases 27 times in a single decade in the 1880s. So this is a period of huge boom and expansion and social disruption in people's lives. People are coming from Europe, from Asia, immigrating to America, and emigrating within the nation, coming from the East Coast, the South, moving around. There's just huge social mobility in America at this time. And with that comes a lot of social disruption. A lot of people lose their old institutions and their old way of lives. The churches they attended or the synagogues they attended, the social clubs and village festivals and folk culture that they lived in and inhabited and gave them institutions and organized their lives for many decades and centuries kind of falls away. And so there are a lot of people who are in places like Chicago, in parts of America in the 1800s, that are really looking for new institutions and new anchors for their lives. This is especially true for working class people who move around more in many ways and follow factories and slaughterhouses and go where the labor is. And so two key institutions emerge in the second half of the 1800s to give community and build institution for these populations. The first is the saloon, and the second is the political party. Neither is invented in this period, but they really take off as central aspects of American culture. And first, with the rise of the saloons, there's huge growth in saloons everywhere across America. Less so a little bit in the South, but in the West, in the North, there's incredible growth in saloons until by the 1890s, there's something like 250,000 saloons in America. There's one saloon for every 500 people in New York and one saloon for every 335 people in Chicago. I calculated this once, there are 17 saloons back then for every Starbucks we have today. So this is a huge booming culture. And this is especially a beer-focused saloon culture that, as many of you probably know, whiskey was really predominant in American drinking in the first third or first half of the 1800s. There's a huge boom in production of corn and rye and wheat as states like Illinois get opened up to commerce. And the easiest thing to do with that is to turn it into whiskey and sell it to people. There's a huge boom in alcoholism that goes with it, and in things like dram shops and liquor groceries where you go in, you pay a couple pennies for a shot and you leave. It's not really very social drinking. In the second half of the 1800s, with huge immigration, especially of German immigrants and Czech immigrants, beer culture really takes over saloons, especially people drinking lagers, drinking the new Pilsners, which are a form of lager. That really takes off as kind of the predominant way to drink in America. In Irish saloons, people still drink whiskey. All these other drinks are still available. Cocktail culture is booming during this period, but the standard drink is usually some kind of a lager. And these saloons provide an anchor and a community for really disrupted populations that need it. There's incredible diversity in the saloon culture, especially among immigrant populations. Most saloons in the 1800s, they have somewhat of a German culture to them. Even if everyone in there drinking isn't German, Germans make up the largest population of immigrants and have the kind of the deepest beer drinking culture. So there's almost a German vibe, even if there are no Germans in the bar you're drinking in. But there's a lot of mixing. The kind of the stereotype that the Irish go to the Irish bar, the Germans go to the German bar, the Jews go to the Jewish bar, it doesn't really work that way. There's a lot more diversity of mixing, especially among working class people. There's great diversity and integration in these saloons. These are really the clubs, the societies for working class people. They're not well integrated, obviously, among race. These are places that are not welcoming often to African Americans. They're welcoming to ethnic white people, but there are definitely African American saloons all around the country, in the South, in the Northeast, in places like Chicago. And there are also saloons that become political machines. There's a great community in Philadelphia, Gilball's Saloon, which is right across the street from an Irish saloon run by the Irish Democratic Machine. The African American saloon is also a gathering place for Republican voters. And they're basically at political war with each other. But the African American saloon keeper of the Republican saloon and the Irish Democratic saloon keeper across the street were good friends and drank together, even as they kind of were in political competition. these saloons are these saloons are dominantly male spaces, but there are definitely women engaged in all aspects of the production, the selling, and the consumption of beer. That we know there's this incredible history of women brewing beer in America, and people simply need to work. So they're great diaries and letters of women who work in saloons and kind of live in this culture. Even if it's not the stereotype, they're still present and active. Now, these saloons that draw people together, especially this big population of working class men, provide an answer to a political problem, which is, in a democracy, anyone who's done political organizing has known this, you need to find the people. How can you find, organize, and mobilize people? That the votes are out there, and when you're looking for them, it feels like they're nowhere to be found. But saloons were gathering together this population that is deeply engaged in politics and really can benefit from politics and really cares. The same period as saloons are peaking in the second half of the 1800s is when voter turnout peaks in America. Voter turnout shoots up in the 1840s to something like 70–80% of eligible voters turning out at the polls to vote. And for the next lifetime, until 1900, voter turnout nationally averages something like 77% of eligible people. In some places, in Indiana, in certain places that are particularly contentious, 90% of eligible voters are going to the polls whenever they can. This is a really hot political environment. And it's also a really partisan political environment. If you're a Democrat, you raise your children to be Democrats and their children to be Democrats, and same for the Republicans and the Whigs and all the other parties. Partisanship is really built into identity. And yet it's almost amorphous. Where are these parties? Well, the saloons, in addition to gathering people, give an anchor for these parties. There aren't many institutions in 19th century America, especially in newer places like Chicago. There aren't the same built-in legacy for generation and generation locations to gather. So saloons turn into this key political nexus. For one thing, voting isn't really run that centrally by the government in 19th century America. So voting often happens in saloon. They would set up a ballot box in a saloon or by the window of a saloon, and people would come in to vote there. They would get a drink and they would vote, and they would be given a ballot by an activist. So saloons really are where democracy is happening, where ballots are literally being cast in many places in 19th century America. And along with that, there's a lot of vote buying that goes on. These are not clean elections, and often a glass of beer was what you would use to win over somebody who wasn't sure how they would vote. Often party activists would go in and treat people to a glass of beer or sometimes brandy or whiskey to win them over. And, you know, if you wanted to influence a poll judge who's supposed to be making sure that these elections are clean, there are all these accounts of bartenders just sending beer after beer after beer to the poll judge until they can't really tell what's going on anymore. A lot of political activists talk about trying to get the exact right level of drunkenness for voters, that they would still participate and they could be trusted to do what you wanted them to, but they weren't so drunk that they'd fall asleep and never vote, because ultimately the goal is to get them to cast a ballot. Now, these saloons also become political headquarters. This is where the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, I'm sorry, is there a chat I should be seeing? Oh, yes, yes, I agree. This is where the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, when they organize events, it's at saloons. They gather people around in the back room. They plan marches, demonstrations. They plot assassinations sometimes in these saloons. This is where political life happens. And for this reason, saloon keepers often become local political leaders, often become aldermen and mayors. They don't usually become presidents or senators, but the guys who run the machines on the ground, they're often saloon keepers. And it's also what brings young people into the same culture, in this same system. That the way a lot of people got involved in politics is at 12 years old, at 15 years old, they started hanging out at the corner saloon and they started doing little errands for the saloon. Maybe they'd fetch a pail of beer, fill it up with beer and bring it to a political meeting. Or maybe they would make sure voters got to the polls on election day, or distributed pamphlets that were brought to the saloon. It's really where a lot of people in their teens start getting engaged in politics. And we have mayors, congressmen, governors into the 20th century who say they got their first start hanging out in a saloon at age 12. You know, this is what taught them about politics. The school system isn't great back then. Almost none of these people are going to college. The way they get educated is they hang around with older people who are running these machines out of saloons. When Rudyard Kipling comes to America in the 1880s, he says he gets tired of hearing, whenever he asks how somebody got involved in politics, well, he used to run a saloon. That it's almost like the cliche that's how you get engaged. And so saloons really form a key nexus for disrupted people who need a home, need an identity, need a community, and political parties who need voters. But this is where the mass of the population is, and that's exactly what political organizers need more than anything else. They need the votes. So saloons become really a center of political life in 19th century America, from the 1850s, 1840s, all the way through to about 1900. And there's no way to prove this, but I've always felt like the fact that they're drinking beer, and specifically the fact that they're drinking relatively low alcohol lagers, says something about the political life that's going on. That the way you interact with somebody else when you're sitting around drinking beer all day is different than the way you behave when you've been drinking just shots of whiskey or even higher alcohol ales. That you sit, you talk, you converse. There's a reason these people are drinking lagers and pilsners and 4 and 5% alcohol drinks as opposed to drinking something much stronger. It kind of creates a perfect environment for discussion, for chatting. These saloons really become salons for working class people in America, for diverse populations that are looking for a home and an anchor. Now, not everybody's happy about this. There's a movement for political reform that takes on speed and power over the second half of the 1880s, 1890s, into 1900s to clean up American democracy. And this movement is almost entirely of well-to-do, wealthier Americans. And they're really upset with the way democracy looks on the ground. And they combine really mixed goals. On the one hand, this is a dirty system. This is an unequal system. It's an unfair system. And it's by no means a golden age we should feel bad about going away. On the other hand, in addition to wanting to clean up politics, they publicly express, these kind of upper middle class reformers, that they want to suppress the vote of poorer people, that they don't like a system where the saloon keeper, the garbage man, the street sweeper runs the political machines. There's definite class bias and voter suppression and ethnic bias. They don't like the idea that Irish Catholics and Russian Jews are playing a greater role in the political system. There's definitely a darker motivation in addition to cleaning up politics. So this reform movement looks around society and to see how they can reduce the role of working class voters in society while cleaning up politics. And they see the saloons as their target. The Anti-Saloon League, which eventually brings about Prohibition, emerges to suppress the votes of poor people as much as it emerges to get people to stop drinking alcohol. And it's really important that the key institution is the Anti-Saloon League. It's not the anti-drinking beer quietly in your house league or anti-drinking brandy in the gentleman's club league. It's saloons. It's this nexus of drinking and working class politics that they target. And they do so really successfully. For the 20, 30 years before Prohibition happens in 1920, on state referenda across the country, saloons are closed down. And every time a saloon gets closed down, it closes down a working class political institution, which allows for greater closing downs down the line. It might happen just in a district or a county that saloons are closed down or alcohol is banned, or that saloons are closed down even on election day. But when you suppress that vote, it allows them to do it on a state level. This happens in a lot of states. There are like 50 referenda around the country in the early 1900s closing down saloons. And they're successful in the South. They're successful in kind of more like parts of the Midwest that are more dominated by Yankee populations and parts of New England. They're very unsuccessful in places like Illinois and New York and Pennsylvania, that big diverse states that have large populations of immigrants and working class populations. They're just, the idea of closing down saloons to those populations is just really anathema. But they close down enough saloons that voter turnout really begins to crash. Eligible voter turnout in 1896, the last election of the 1800s, is 79%. Over the next generation, turnout of voters just plummets until by the 1920s, fewer than half of voters are going to the polls. 30% of voters stop participating over this 20-year period. And it's the same period that saloons are closing and Prohibition is gaining momentum. And that's not a coincidence. This age of real deep engagement in politics by working class people is really tied up with this age of public drinking in saloons. And as they fall together. And kind of the front lines of this whole battle, which some of you may have heard of, is the First Ward Ball in Chicago. Now, this was this notorious political fundraiser that happened, I don't know Chicago that well, but in the Levee district, which is in the South Loop, I believe like 18th Street, 20th Street. I don't know where that is. Maybe you know better than I do. But it's a political fundraiser organized by the political machine in Chicago, the Democratic machine, and a number of saloon keepers who invite They invite the local political leaders. The mayor comes, the aldermen come, the political machines come. They invite the madams and the prostitutes from the local red light district. They invite the criminal element. They invite everyone they can. They bring down elephants from Baraboo, from Ringling Brothers, and they serve something like 35,000 quarts of beer at these things. It turns into this raucous party they hold once a year. There's dancing, there's a Congo line, and it all goes to combining alcohol and political fundraising. And this kind of powers the Chicago machine, which is one of the most powerful democratic machines in America. And it infuriates these reformers we're talking about, the kind of people who don't like public consumption of alcohol and don't love the idea of working class immigrants voting. The first ward ball is the prime target, and they can't shut down the ball. But eventually, in I believe 1909, they get the liquor license pulled from the ball. So the final ball has to be a sober ball. And when you take alcohol out, when you remove that element, the final ball is tragic. They're descriptions of this first ward ball where the lights are on, these political machine operatives are sitting around drinking tea. And it's just clear that someone turned on the lights on this era, that the era of saloon politics, of this combination of working class political engagement and public drinking is just at an end. And Prohibition is a few years later. This is this period when this whole era kind of dies away. And it's a deeply flawed era. A lot of it was problematic, but it also showed some real benefits that our political system lacks today. And I think, you know, as we all sit at our computers here after 6 months of this pandemic and isolation, I think we can all understand the appeal of a gathering place like a saloon, like a community to talk, to drink, especially during this election. Political organizers have noted how hard it is to gather people when you can't physically bring them to one place. And the saloons played that role. And it's not ideal, but I think we can all empathize with why disrupted people wanted to gather together in the 19th century in saloons and why that introduced them to politics. And I think we can all look forward to a time when we can all drink together again. And that's, I guess, the talk I would give. I'd love to answer any questions you have. I haven't been paying attention to the chat, so if anyone wants to ask a question in person that they put in the chat, that would be fine too.
Yeah, I was just wondering how anyone could tolerate any sort of political anything without alcohol.
Yeah, I wonder about it for the reformers who are these very sober, upright, you know, Victorian individuals. I don't know how they got through it. Maybe laudanum secretly, but
Yeah. If you guys have any questions, please ask it in the chat. I'm also going to go monitor Facebook to see what's happening over there. I often think about what, and you know, you don't have a magic 8-ball, but you often think about how our country would have evolved, in which direction we would have taken without these saloons as gathering spaces. You know, I don't know if it was just the camaraderie and sort of the alcohol that fueled it. And you know, one of the things that I think that is really a positive and powerful aspect of alcohol is that when those inhibitions come down, it's sort of kind of like everyone's in the same playing field, right? It doesn't matter who you are, where you come from, who your parents are, you know, your income bracket. It's sort of like in that saloon space, you're all there for the same reasons, and there's just a true genuineness that exists. And I just really wonder what would have become of our country without these public spaces, public drinking spaces.
yeah, I can't answer that question, but I definitely agree. I mean, especially if you think about all these immigrant populations, how they all became, to a large degree, to feel as one, to feel as become Americans. We have the stereotype of the Germans in the German saloon and the Irish in the Irish saloon, but largely these saloons are open to most immigrant populations, and they mix together really well. That there's kind of a working class camaraderie that exists between a lot of these populations, and they drink together. And, you know, coming at the end of this era, a lot of these people just identified as American. You know, not that they should have to leave behind any of their old identities, but the saloon was a really great kind of low stakes place for immigrant populations to come together, to feel some sense of camaraderie, and to join together in some kind of larger culture.
Rudy is asking, There's plenty of one-off events in bars, saloons, but do you think that there's a place for a sustained political organization in bars, third places in present day?
Place. There could be. I mean, bars existed. It's not like everyone stopped. I always have to remind myself, it's not like everyone stopped drinking together in 1900 and never, you know, it's like a great bar culture in places like Chicago and around the country for the century and 20 years after this period. I just feel like in the early 1900s, I think one of the things they do is they separate out political engagement from the rest of life, that it becomes kind of inappropriate to talk politics at the dinner table, at the bar. And a lot of people who previously would have argued over the election, organized campaigns, kept really quiet about their political views. And I think some of that's falling away today for good and for bad. But yeah, this attitude that you shouldn't talk politics in public with strangers really made it harder to organize politically. And I think it is harmful to getting ourselves to really understand what's going on, honestly. The more we can publicly, civilly discuss politics over a beer, the better we're going to be at this level of engagement, the less hostility there is. Now, they also killed each other over politics in the 19th century. So I'm not saying this was a golden age. You know, there's a real dark side to this story too. But I do think the better we are at talking about these things publicly, the better off we'll be.
I actually, Rudy, sometimes I think about this, and I actually think about social media as being sort of one aspect of that. You know, like just think about a lot of the good things and a lot of the toxicity that happens on Facebook. Hi, Facebook people. You know, it's sort of, especially during these times of just political importance. There's a lot of opinions that happen, but I also believe that, you know, there's something incredibly vital to the in-person, one-on-one, face-to-face conversation, because the information that is exchanged can be so different compared to, you know, hiding behind a computer, right?
And you can't walk away. You know, you're face-to-face. You have to be able to back up your opinion. You have to be able to interact civilly with somebody else. I often say, I'm not on Twitter. I don't mean to insult anyone who is, but I often ask people who are really into Twitter, would you hang out in a bar where people behave this way? And I think the answer is no. Like, we have standards for public behavior, and I would love it if we extended those standards to social media.
Yeah, no, I'm definitely with you on that. I wondering if you can, I know you have a book coming out next year, and I'm wondering if you could maybe tell us a little bit about that book. The book is called The Age of Acrimony, How Americans Fought to Fix Their Democracy, 1865 to 1915. Yeah,
that's right. I went down a rabbit hole. I got really interested in this question of why voter turnout crashed and why we think of the world we grew up in as a period of calm politics, and the world we live in now is a period of uncalm politics, uncivil politics. So I figured if you want to explain why things are uncivil today, you have to explain our standards for what civil was. And I started to realize that the calm politics of the 20th century that we were all used to was a deliberate creation out of a fight over how politics should work in the 19th century. That this period in the 1800s, when people are killing each other over politics and voting in huge numbers, created a debate, a big public fight over how people should engage in democracy. And the end result was kind of going with what I'm talking about in this talk, a much more restrained style of democracy in the 20th century. That there's a deliberate effort by reformers to get people to stop talking about politics in public, stop demonstrating, stop drinking, stop things like the First Ward Ball. And so we all grew up with an artificial sense of how democracy should work because we grew up in this era when things had been deliberately calmed down. But if you look back further into American history, you can see how tense, how uncivil, how partisan things were. And I don't mean to be telling an ugly story with it. I think it's kind of uplifting because it shows, one, that you can change your democracy. You can deliberately say, I'm not happy with how the system works, we can change it. But it also shows the trade-offs of that happening, that we, along with calming down politics in the early 20th century, Americans really significantly killed off the fun and the engagement and the turnout. So I started to write this book, and then I found that every anecdote I wanted to tell, every kind of signpost along the way, there was this family that just kept coming up, the Kelly family. some of you may have heard of them. They're a Philadelphia family. The father was a man named William Pig Iron Kelly, who was a congressman, and his daughter was Florence Kelly, who lived in Chicago for quite some time and worked at Hull House and was a labor reformer. And I started to realize that every moment in this narrative of fighting over the role of democracy in public life, the Kellys, this father and this daughter, this kind of dynasty of American history, are arguing about the same issue. So I tried to use this book to tell the story of a father-daughter dynasty that kind of explains this fight over democracy, that in the end explains where our sense of what normal politics is. And it just turned out to be a really fun project. They know everybody, they have brawls and divorces and assassinations, and their life is just a really interesting life story. And it was exciting to make a personal narrative out of this big structural story. So it's coming out next April, and I'd be happy to continue talking about it for about an hour, but I'm not sure you want that right now.
Yeah, I mean, that actually sounds fascinating. I mean, who you know, fights, affairs, drinking. It sounds like a very Chicago-centric book. Rudy wants to know when it gets published.
It comes out in April 2021, Bloomsbury Press. And yeah, there's a lot. It starts out as a Philadelphia story. I'm a Philadelphian, and I was kind of excited to tell this narrative of my hometown. But then I realized that just as Philadelphia gets replaced by Chicago as the second largest city in America in the late 19th century, Florence Kelly moves to Chicago, and all these people, the Chicago political machine, Jane Addams and Hull House, Henry Damaris Lloyd and the reformers who are living in Winnetka and Madison, they become the nexus of this fight over the place of democracy in American life. And so you can't tell this story of the late 19th century in America or of political reform without talking about Chicago. And so I just got sucked into how interesting a place it is.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of reads like a soap opera almost, right? Well, when the book finally gets published and life is back to normal, we'll have to have you actually come to Chicago.
Yes, please.
And have a talk with the museum here. If anyone has any other questions for Jon, please ask. I have a question. What are you drinking?
Oh, well, I figured I should drink a Pilsner. And this is a, it's from Alexandria. I don't know if you guys know the Port City Brewery, Alexandria, Virginia. They're a German Pilsner, and I'm enjoying it. It's a nice beer. It's a good afternoon beer.
You can't beat a good Pilsner, a good lager these days, honestly.
Yes, I've always felt they're kind of underappreciated in American drinking. So
Lucas is toasting. What are you drinking, Lucas?
Macro beer, too embarrassed to say. But in a beautiful German glass.
I say drink what you like. That's the answer.
Wait, well, I don't know if I'm doing that either, but still.
I also, if anybody else wants to share what they're drinking, I always like to know. Rudy, what do you got there? Oh, Kinslager, is that right?
Yeah, I got their comparison, their Fest beer versus their Märzen mixed pack. So great lager.
I mean, this is the golden era, people. Just stumble and you'll find a good beer somewhere. Flywheel, awesome, from Metropolitan. Joey's drinking. Their Metro's Oktoberfest, speaking of, Rudy, was consumed faster than I've ever seen any beer be consumed. It's all gone, I think. I don't even know if you can get
Oh, really?
Yeah. So that tells you that.
So maybe this is not a question you can answer quickly. What's the Chicago beer I should be drinking then? I used to live in Madison. I drank a lot of Wisconsin beer, but I never got that into Chicago beer. What should I be drinking? What am I missing out on?
I'm trying to think of what you can get in DC or Virginia. We have so many great breweries. If anyone wants to chime in, I mean, I'm a big fan of Metropolitan. I'm a big fan of Off Color Brewing. I'm a big fan of Half Acre. You might be able to get Half Acre.
Yeah.
Well, I'm just going to have to send you a beer package, Jon.
Yeah, I will not say no to that.
And you tell me what you think of some of these beers. Who else, guys? For my Chicagoans in here, who else would you want to throw Jon's way? Speak up or forever hold your beer. You guys have favorites? Who should we be drinking out of DC?
Oh, I shouldn't have asked if I wasn't ready to say a bunch. This Port City Brewery is really strong. They're from Arlington. DC Brow. that's probably the most prevalent one you see around, and
Sure.
I'm really happy with their pale ale. It's just always a steady, reliable beer. People like the Right Proper Brewery a lot.
Mhm.
There's some good options. You need to, when life is normal and American History Museum is having beer events again, you need to come and
I know.
sample things.
I was there in April of 19 for the American Culture Association, Popular Cultural Association conference, and did some stuff with you guys. And I definitely drank my way around the city, which is kind of the only way to do it, right? Rudy suggested Mars. Mars is great. They do some funky stuff, and then Dovetail, which is another German-centric beer. So, I'll definitely put a little beer box for you and have the beer fairy deliver it your way.
That'd be excellent.
The other thing you should know is I didn't know you were from Philadelphia, John. Somebody in our team, one of our advisory board members, is a woman, good friend of mine, Karen Abbott. And you need to know her because she wrote the book about the Everleigh sisters, who were the sort of the prime time brothel.
Yeah.
Were involved in all the first ward stuff. So you two need to connect as natives of the same city and also conversers of similar interests in history.
Yeah, I have a question for you guys about that. I noticed Rudy mentioned the Everleigh Club too. Is the first ward ball stuff common knowledge where you are? When I read about it, I was just so blown away. Is it something that you feel like people know about in Chicago?
I think history geeks, Chicago history geeks, know about it. I think anyone who has maybe looked into a little bit of alcohol history in Chicago knows about it. I don't know if the everyday person does. I mean, I feel like I'm too entrenched in this world because it's sort of like one of those things I think about that's usually like, bouncing around in my hollow head often. But I don't know. Does anyone else out there know if you guys are familiar with the First Ward and the Levy District and Everleigh Club? If anyone knows, chime in. Chime in. Oh, right. Devil in the White City and the World's Fair, that book sort of, I think, brought to light, sort of reinvigorated everyone's interest in the World's Fair. And I think that sort of, that 1890s era started to become sort of very much in trend. And I want to say also kind of romanticized. And I feel that the fair and semblances of the Levy District, since they were all connected, sort of got people interested again, for sure. I honestly think, I know I'm a little bit biased, but I think that Abbott's book certainly brought people together around this common story and got them pretty excited. I've never seen people so excited about a brothel. Maybe I've had a visitor, so maybe there are, of course, but like a 19th century brothel for sure. But definitely Abbott's book is pretty fantastic.
There's a good book on, it's probably 30 years old. Let me look it up while I'm talking to you guys, on the political machine of the levy, the Lords of the Levy.
Yeah.
I don't remember who wrote it. I'm going to look it up right now.
Was that wasn't Herman Cogan, was it?
Yeah, it's not even that old. I'm wrong. It's Herman Cogan and Lloyd Went, Lords of the Levy. It's about Bathhouse John and Hinky Dink Kenna and these guys who ran this wild political machine, the Gray Wolves. Lincoln Steffens called them. I mean, Chicago's the center of the story of how working class populations and political machines and saloons all intersect for good and for bad.
Yeah, and for good and for bad, I don't think much of it has changed. It's just different.
That's your business, not mine. I'm not supposed to. I can't get the museum in any trouble right now.
All right, John, is there anything else you want to share or leave us with before we sign off here for the afternoon?
You guys have such expertise on this. Did you hear anything I said that you disagreed with? I'm always interested. Who knows better,
No, I mean, awesome talk, and I really appreciate your knowledge. And I mean, hey, you're the curator at the Smithsonian, so I don't think we can argue with that expertise, right?
Argue away.
Yes,
Yes.
Lucas. The Smithsonian Food History. Do you know anything about that, John?
I just know it's an incredible organization. I haven't worked on
Yeah.
it this year, but I worked on it in the past. Teresa McCullough and Paula Johnson. I mean, they've really built, I think, kind of the ideal combination of real world expertise from chefs, from practitioners, from activists, and from scholars and academics who study this stuff. It's really kind of a great nexus for who's done the research versus who's done it in real life. I think it's kind of the ideal of what public history and engagement with the public should be. So I don't know that much about this year, but I would recommend, everyone tune in.
Yeah. So the Smithsonian has the American National Museum of American History has a food history initiative, of which beer and craft beer are a part of. And every year they host a food history weekend. And this year it is October 15th through the 17th. I'll throw a link in the chat. And there's definitely going to be a session on beer culture. So, and Teresa will be overseeing that. So please check that one out. The Smithsonian has been an amazing partner to us over the last couple of years, and we certainly appreciate you being involved with our efforts and for your support. John, thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us. Always great to hear from you guys and learn from you, and I'm excited to get you to Chicago.
Yeah, I can't wait.
That book.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for bringing me. It's great to speak with you all. And anyone who wants to get in touch, I love talking about this stuff, and it seems like you have a wealth of knowledge. I guess email Liz and she can put us in touch. I'd be happy to speak with anybody.
Contact me anytime, liz@chicagobruseum.org.
Yeah, and that's, if you want to talk about this stuff, if you have political objects you think might be interesting for the Smithsonian, we're always kind of looking out there to see what, we've been working on collecting stuff from the Daily legacy. So, anything you might have that would be interesting.
There's definitely people around here who have some Daily related objects. So I'll definitely put them in touch with you.
Awesome. Cool.
John, thank you again. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. www.chicagobruseum.org is where you can learn more about who we are, what we do, what we're doing, what we'll do next. That's where you can donate to all of the free program we've been doing. 2 quick announcements. Next program will be October 14th when we welcome Penn State University professor Kathleen Cahill, who's going to talk about the women of color who transformed the suffrage movement, and other events coming up in October. And then, of course, save the dates, November 11th through 14th for this year's virtual Beer Culture Summit. We'll be having all kinds of content in a variety of formats. Beer, too. How about that? All right, everybody. Have a great rest of your weekend. Thanks again for joining us. See you next time.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.
Cheers.